I hope everyone had a good lunch, and thank you again to our sponsors for helping to make it possible today. We've already discussed a lot of great things today so far, and our panel now is entitled Making It Local, Challenges and Solutions. And so in this panel, you have here a great group of folks from around the country who are in local and state government who are really starting to play an important role in making sure solutions meet the needs of their communities and starting to pilot and think through new ways of doing it, particularly in the absence of means-tested programs and more things at the federal level that are needed that we've discussed a bit today. So with that, I'm going to quickly start getting into the discussion because there's so much we'd really like to cover in this panel. We have a few more folks getting in the room. So what we're going to start with is each panelist will in turn share some of the local challenges they're facing in their communities or states related to increasing disaster risks and providing financial protections to households, but then really get into the corresponding solutions that they're exploring. So I'll start by introducing Liz. Liz Russell is the Louisiana State Director at the Environmental Defense Fund. She defines Louisiana-based policy and policy objectives and works to design and implement strategies for effective state and federal policy engagement to improve outcomes for citizens in the state. Liz, it's great to have you here today. Can you lead us off by sharing from your perspective some of the key elements of the insurability, or as Francis called it, the risk crisis as it is in Louisiana, and what are some of the solution pathways you and partners are working towards?
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon. So I want to start with the climate reality that is faced in Louisiana, where we're both experiencing disaster after disaster, and we see ourselves as very reliant on the industries that continue to perpetuate the climate future. That existential crisis is sort of pervasive in the state, and it comes back up in how we think about homeowners and residential insurance and who has access to insurance by comparison with the industrial facilities that have access to insurance and continue to receive investment in extremely disaster-prone areas. I want to highlight, obviously, the extent to which we've seen an 18.5% increase in insurance premiums since Hurricane Laura and Delta made landfall in late 2020. And in that context, Louisiana Citizens, our insurer of last resort as it was initially designed, has almost tripled in the number of policies that are held by constituents across the state. I want to acknowledge there that low-income residents are unlikely to be able to afford a Louisiana Citizens policy, in part because of the statutory requirement that citizens provide a 10% increase over the highest available priced insurance policy, making it prohibitively expensive for Louisiana residents. In that additional context, we've seen our building codes get passed. We're one of the first states to have adopted the ICC's 2021 building codes. We also see the state legislature this past session move $30 million to a fortified roof program. That program is supposed to launch on October 1st. The scale of it is rapidly flip-flopping and evolving, and other folks in this room obviously can talk more about that. But I do want to acknowledge in that context that currently the program is not designed to be either means-tested or geographically restrictive in terms of the areas that are receiving the highest risk or highest wind loads. So there's lots of questions about the program design, implementation, and rolling out over time. In the political context, we just confirmed a new insurance commissioner who will come into office on January 9th. Commissioner Jim Donnellan will be leaving after 18 years, and future Commissioner Tim Temple, who was born out of the insurance industry, his family is tied to the insurance industry, and would have self-financed a 7-figure campaign if he had had to run, but is walking into the seat unopposed, will be taking office and has already said publicly that he sees Louisiana's insurance crisis as tied to overregulation. Some of the key points that he's already made about things he wants to do even at the first day in office include we're the only state that has a requirement for insurers to not drop a policy or a policy holder if they've had that policy for 3+ years. We also We also see that he wants to roll back restrictions on rate changes to once a year. He wants that to be able to happen as frequently as an insurer sees as necessary. There are big questions around the influence of trial attorneys in Louisiana, as well as the influence of Louisiana residents that are starting to, across the board, see the insurance crisis as top of mind and a top of mind issue for Louisiana residents across the state, but especially in South Louisiana. And so I want to acknowledge that. There are a number of solutions that are starting to come to the fore, and there are a number of groups, some who are in this room and some who are not, who are simmering with ideas about how we think about redesigning Louisiana Citizens and what it looks like to double down on an intentionally designed Louisiana Citizens that expands the role of the public sector and thinks really purposefully about how to support low-income Louisianans and Louisianans that have experienced decades and generations of intentional and unintentional marginalization. But what does it look like right now for the increasing vulnerability of the Louisiana taxpayer as more Louisianans rely on Louisiana Citizens to be a backstop? What does it look like if and when there is a Hurricane Ida and so many policyholders are actually going back to the state budget to pay out those insurance claims? That's not how Louisiana Citizens is currently designed. And so there are some existential questions about how to retrofit the program to be able to accommodate over time deeper public or private investment. We also need to be better about quantifying the benefits of the tremendous investments that we're making in coastal restoration, in watershed-based water management, and within levee floodplain management as well, as we continue to increase and upgrade our drainage systems, our pumping systems, systems that are incredibly sophisticated. What does it look like to better quantify those coastal restoration investments, the non-structural and structural risk reduction measures, and the watershed management that we see occurring across the state? How do we use the world-leading data that we have around the impacts of Louisiana's coastal master plan to actually quantify the improvements that we're seeing to increase public will for continued support for those investments, but to also illustrate the benefits that we see when it comes to insuring or responding after disaster? There are also benefits of more widespread, potentially watershed-based land use planning. Partners like the Center for Planning Excellence that have done incredible work for years on land use planning activities that are able to accommodate the scale of water management for Louisiana, which drains 41% of the country, everything from the Rocky Mountains to Appalachia. There are questions about microinsurance, possibly parametric insurance, especially available to low-income and marginalized people. And then there are continued questions of how we think about insuring or don't continued expansion of industrial facilities, especially petrochemical facilities, LNG facilities, and expanding carbon capture and hydrogen facilities that are being deployed directly adjacent to the residential homeowners who are not able to get access to insurance. I want to acknowledge the question of political viability because it's something that we continue to talk about here today, but also dance around to some extent. We are in a place where we are continually exacerbating risk by allowing new development in lots of our high risk, especially in the context of flood, but in the context of lots of high risk areas. So what does it look like to actually begin to invest in political strategies that acknowledge those vulnerabilities? In Louisiana, the question of climate-induced migration is not a future scenario. In many cases, especially after disaster, residents with resources are able to pick up and move to areas that they perceive as higher and safer grounds, especially those who have the financial and social networks to be able to do so. In areas that are losing population, that means that we have decline in tax bases, decline in ability to maintain social services, decline in ability to maintain infrastructure or to invest in new risk reduction infrastructure. And then on the sort of opposite side of that, those communities that might identify more as receiving communities that are expected to remain high and dry over time, we see schools doubling in size, we see traffic swelling, but we also see new development expanding without any regard for where water should be going now or in the future. That is improving on a parish-to-parish basis. There are some parishes that have really taken efforts to reduce development trends in those higher risk areas, but that's really dependent on the political jurisdiction. And as we all know in this room, water pays no attention to political boundaries. So the importance and the significance of continuing the efforts initiated by the Louisiana Watershed Initiative to that effect and expanding those, again, pursuing more holistic land use planning and longer term policy there, both through legislative action as well as regulatory improvements, are going to be critical to that. But we have a condition where in Louisiana, we have landowners very influential at the state legislature. We have developers very influential at the state legislature, trial lawyers very influential at the state legislature. And I do want to put in the room, for those of us in this room that are able to either engage in 501c4 activities or engage directly in lobbying and electoral action through our private sector roles, having the insurance industry and the financial sector begin to actually play a role in ensuring that legislators are at the very least educated on the implications of the decisions that they are making or not is something that we're not talking about enough. How do we communicate with legislators? How do we help elect legislators who are willing to move on policies that we know are necessary to reduce risk over time? How do we make sure that our regulators are actually in a role where they can do that not on their own, where they are not on an island as a regulator, but they actually have the support of the governor's administration. They have the support of legislators who are willing to, in their committee rooms, in their insurance committee rooms, think holistically about the insurance crisis in Louisiana. With that, I'll probably pause. I know we'll circle back around to a number of those points.
We'll certainly circle back. Thanks, Liz. Sticking with statewide challenges, I'd next like to introduce Ann. Ann Robertson has more than 2 decades of experience serving the citizens of South Carolina. She is currently the program manager for the South Carolina Safe Home Mitigation Grant Program through the South Carolina Department of Insurance and played a pivotal role in founding the program back in 2007. Ann, can you please share a bit with us about your program and how you're seeking to explore microinsurance solutions and others given the challenges you see for vulnerable populations across the state?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me here today. Yes, I am with Safe Home Program, and it is a program within the South Carolina Department of Insurance. It was created 16 years ago. It was a part of the Omnibus Coastal Property Insurance Reform Act that was passed in 2007-2008 session. And within that act, there were numerous incentives, catastrophe savings account, premium tax reductions for fortification measures, the creation of the Safe Home Program, and other incentives. The idea was really to try to incentivize homeowners and make them want to do things to make their homes more attractive to insurance companies, to make them want to write there. To date, we have retrofitted more than 8,000 existing homes, totaling more than $34 million. We have worked recently, within the last couple of years, with IBHS and now offer dual designations. We offer both Safe Home and Fortified Roof designations. And the reason that we do that is because programs are very, very similar, and they also will help the homeowner receive the greatest premium reduction that we can get them. That is, the big buy-in, I guess, from what we've been talking about here a little bit earlier in incentives. Safe Home is not only charged with creating this grant program, we're also in charge with increasing the awareness and understanding the need for resiliency and stronger homes. And what we're seeing recently is a slower uptake in grants. Usually when we open, we'll run out of our allocation within 45 minutes. We opened July 5th, And it took us almost a month this time to use that allocation. So we've seen this happen primarily since COVID. And we think a lot of it might have been because of supply chain issues. Maybe people are just concerned about what's going to be happening with the economy. But we have seen that grow, and that time, that slower time, uptake time, grow a bit. So with the help of Ceres and Carolyn and Helen, they did a study for South Carolina to try to look at what's going on from a recovery and resiliency standpoint. They completed that back in April and released that study. And then with the help of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and I'm going to call out Eleanor with her help too, we were able to obtain a grant for us to work with the South Carolina Office of Resiliency and partner with Coastal Carolina University to try to focus in on what we're seeing happen in the watershed areas of South Carolina, particularly the PD and Santee watershed areas. And if anyone's familiar with the state, that area is just a little bit off the coast, but we get a lot of the runoff from North Carolina all the way down. And these folks, they were hit in 2015, they were hit in 2016, and then they got some more in 2017. And so, unfortunately, these are more rural areas. We see a higher level of low to moderate income homes there and households. And these folks have a really, really hard time recovering from the first one, much less anything following. So we are working, as I said, with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to complete the survey and study to try to get a better sense of what is it going to take for them to be able to, one, participate in the Safe Home program, not rely so much on FEMA and other resources once the impact occurs. And is it something like a parametric program, or what do we need to do, and how can we address it? So we're early and very far behind most of these other folks, but we are really trying to get a grasp on it, and we have completed, I believe, a little more than 600 interviews thus far, with another 400 to 500 on their way. So we're excited, and I'll be happy to share information once we get the rest of the data in. So.
Thanks, Anne. And I think Anne's being humble, because I think what we really find across everything you guys are speaking to today is that there's different routes each of you are working towards as you move to pilot stages, but that there's tremendous challenges getting to that point. And so South Carolina has one route, as all of you guys do have with others. Turning to cities, I'd like to introduce Tally. Tally Burley is a Senior Policy Advisor on the Resilient and Efficient Buildings team at the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. Her work focuses on building level policy with a focus on housing to ensure New Yorkers have access to affordable financial resources like flood insurance to help make homes more sustainable and resilient. Tally, can you share how your office is currently working to tackle disaster finance challenges in the city? And what are some of your focus areas with what types of solutions you're considering?
Sure. And first, thank you to Helen and Carolyn for putting all of this together today. And as a proud American University alumna, thank you to American for hosting this super important discussion. So as Helen said, I am at the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. And just to put in perspective a little bit what our office does, we are an office that is exclusively dedicated to all things climate change. We have people in our office who are really focused on decarbonization, and we have people in our office who are really focused on resiliency. And we're working collectively at a multi-pronged, multi-scale approach, looking at the city as a whole, at our neighborhoods, at our communities, at our buildings, and at the household level to ensure that we are minimizing our impacts as people on the environment, but also doing what we can to minimize the impacts of the climate for our residents. Everything we do is from a people-centered lens, which is why on the resiliency side, financial resilience is such an important part of what we are doing. New York City has over 520 miles of coastline. We have 5 counties, 5 boroughs. Every single one of those touches the waterfront. And so we are particularly susceptible to coastal flooding like we saw after Hurricane Sandy. That is a climate shock. That was a completely devastating event where 43 New York City residents lost their lives. We are also seeing smaller events as well that aren't necessarily triggering presidential disaster declarations, but are certainly impacting communities. People are self-organizing to move their cars when the high tides come in. They have to take steps to ensure that their homes are prepared, that they can still get to work so that they still have an income. And then on the other side of what we have to deal with on the flooding world is that storms like Ida are becoming much more intense and more frequent as well. And those are really impacting, as Theodora had mentioned in the previous panel, our inland communities. Ida was also incredibly devastating. 13 New York City residents died in basements at that time, and many of them were undocumented. And so the access to the typical financial resources that exist for a lot of the people we've been talking about today were not available for those particular residents. Again, Ida was a climate shock, but even just this weekend, we had some really intense flooding in New York City. I can guarantee you that there were moments when I got stuck in the rain and I could not cross the street because the street was flooded and the water was rushing too quickly. That is not going to get a presidential disaster declaration, but just like those smaller tidal events, they're already impacting people's lives. Before I get into all of the work that we are doing on flood insurance, I just want to acknowledge too that like California and like many of our southern states, extreme heat is really, really important as well. And for a lot of vulnerable populations, people of color, the elderly, people with disabilities, access to air conditioning is a cost that they cannot afford. They do not have the money to put in an air conditioner, and when they can, they do not have the money to run the air conditioner. And so that is also a huge problem when we are thinking about disasters and financing that we need to be thinking about as part of these conversations as well. In terms of the insurance space, after Hurricane Sandy, our office did a lot of work to try to understand what was going on with flood insurance in New York City. We were noticing that a lot of people did not have coverage, and part of that had to do with the fact that our flood maps were extremely outdated. Hurricane Sandy happened in 2012. We haven't had new maps in the New York City since we joined the NFIP in 1983. So you can imagine the number of people who had no idea that their property could ever flood, and so flood insurance was the last thing on their mind. We also found through a study with RAND that nearly a quarter of households were already finding flood insurance to be a financial burden, and that went up to 2/3 for extremely low-income homeowners. That's just homeowners, that's not renters. That was done in 2017. If we were to think about inflation, the pandemic, and all of the economic costs today, I would venture that that percentage would likely be higher. And then during Ida, what we found is, again, the tools that we have to communicate risk are woefully insufficient. And so we had a lot of residents who, again, didn't think that their property could ever flood. They don't have a mandatory requirement to carry a flood insurance policy. And so therefore, they never ever thought about flood insurance. And so risk awareness, in part of this conversation, it's not the only key to the, it's not the only key, but it is an important piece of the puzzle that we need to be thinking about, because having access to that information and making sure that people understand that these resources exist is really, really vital to building that financial resilience. NFIP affordability, the information is huge. There's a lot of misinformation out there as well. During Ida, we had numerous indications from residents that they were told by their insurance provider that they weren't eligible for a flood insurance policy because they weren't in a coastal flood zone. That is obviously not accurate. That means that communication tool is really, really important. And so we work really closely with the Center for New York City Neighborhoods on Flood Help NY to provide information about risk communication, insurance, and flood resiliency retrofits for property owners. We are by no means compelling people to buy an insurance policy, but we're making sure that they have the information out there, that that's a resource for them. We also do a lot of NFIP advocacy, especially around means-tested assistance, to really ensure that flood insurance remains affordable for everyone who needs it. But Ida in particular, I think, underscores some of the other challenges with the existing tools that we have. Basement flooding is something that is a reality, especially in New York City. And those often tend to be dwelling units because we just don't have a lot of available housing stock. We are an expensive city. We don't have a lot of space to build new housing. But a lot of the coverage that exists for properties, for basements, isn't going to cover the things that were destroyed during those events. The other thing that I will say is that the tools that do exist, and I think we've already heard this several times, just take woefully too long to reach people. FEMA, CDBG-DR, all of those come weeks, sometimes months after a storm. But those immediate resources that people need, those are things like my kitchen does not work. I have to go out and buy food because I cannot use my kitchen. That's an expense that a lot of people don't think about. And so working with SBP, with EDF, with the center, we've begun to think about ways that we can diversify the financial tools, because having that access to funding and financing, both under blue skies and post-disaster, can be really valuable to building financial resilience. And we'll get into more of those details later.
Thanks, Tally. Sticking with cities, we'll turn to Nick. Nicholas Bernard is the chief of the Floodplains, Wetlands, and Groundwater Branch at the District of Columbia's Department of Energy and Environment, where he works to make the district and its residents more resilient to flooding. Nick's recent focus has included leading the DC Flood Task Force and overseeing the creation of DC's integrated flood model that will map areas of interior flooding. Nick, can you please share with us more about how DC has been seeking to identify and address local challenges through the DC Flood Task Force, and what are some of the insurance solutions that you're considering?
Yes, happy to. And first of all, Tally, I'll say that in DC, we're super big fans of what you guys are doing and what Theodora is doing, and we watch you guys very closely. And actually, some of my setup is going to sound very familiar, but I'm going to say it anyways because I hope folks in the industry are listening to hear that at least 2 cities are having the same issues, and we're looking for solutions, and hopefully you guys can be a part of it. In the districts, we do have coastal flood risk here in DC. So I work for local government, not federal government. We definitely have that risk from hurricanes, but we're finding in the past 10 years is all of the flooding complaints and issues that we've had are what we call interior flooding, inland flooding. So this is just when too much rain overwhelms the stormwater system and it either backs up into your basement or it backs up onto the streets and then into your basement. And what we're finding in all of this is, number one, most of the time, the people who are being flooded are not in a flood zone because FEMA doesn't map interior flooding. So they didn't even know, like Tally was saying, a lot of people don't even know that they have flood risk. The second thing, let's say they did know they have flood risk. Well, it's too expensive. It takes too long to pay out. And then if you do have flood insurance, miraculously, it doesn't cover the things we needed to cover, especially for basement flooding. Sometimes it's like the NFIP policy in particular doesn't even cover some of those damages because it doesn't meet the definition of an NFIP flood. So we're working on right now in partnership with our Department of Insurance, Securities, and Banking, and also the Office of Risk Management. So we have to have multiple agencies involved. That's how we do it in DC. I know other cities and states have similar arrangements where you can't, one person sort of can't control the whole narrative. But we're working on sort of initial proposals that came out of the flood task force that we had over the past couple years to hit all of those problems and see if we can address them. And what we're ending up with is something we're sort of in the process of working on this, and I should also point out Len Schaubman in the back somewhere has been helping us think through it. There he is. But putting together some kind of proposal that is essentially having a program where between $0 and $10,000 of a damage that the district government will pay it. Now the first 0 to 3 or 4,000 of that money, we want to be very quick payouts. Essentially, you show us, I don't know, a picture or some kind of affidavit, and if our rain gauges say a certain amount of flooding has been hit, we will just send you the money. No questions asked. We're not asking for receipts. We're not telling you how to spend the money. You're just going to get the money. Then what we haven't figured out is between that $3,000 and $10,000 range is what happens there. Is there some kind of claims adjustment? The things to consider is we don't want this to take a long time. We don't want to have a lot of government overhead. We're not going to have the staff in an event of a flood to just like, I don't know, send like 80 people out there to adjust claims. So I don't know what that's going to look like. And actually, I was talking with Theodora earlier, and she was saying you guys spend up to $15,000 without asking too many questions. So maybe that's somewhere we go with that. And then above $10,000, our thought is that maybe that is where the NFIP can be the backstop there. And because we're already guaranteeing payment of $10,000, maybe they can get the highest deductible possible and have a lower NFIP if they want it. So we're sort of thinking through this process now, and ultimately one of the challenges is ultimately we're going to have this funded by someone. I work for the Department of Energy and Environment. We'll be trying to make the case to our mayor and city administrator and say that this is a worthwhile, to have an emergency fund and maybe buy reinsurance for that $10,000. But I think my thought process is this is something that the government needs to fund because the people that we're talking about who need insurance, they need insurance. If they need insurance, they probably can't afford it, and so we need to be providing that service for them, and also not trying to educate and tell them like, oh, you need to buy insurance, get your NFIP policy, because they have a billion other things to worry about that are probably more important on their list than this like probable, 1% chance probable event. So that's where we are now. We'll talk more.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of similarities between the two cities and what you're experiencing. And I think when, some of us reflect on it, again, you guys both have more capacity in many ways in your city governments, but also more bureaucracy as larger cities. And so, you're starting at the forefront of a lot of this, but also by no means it's easier to actually get to a piloting stage. Turning to the West Coast and sticking with the city base, we have Janelle. Janelle Kelman is an environmental lawyer and elected official who most recently served as the mayor of Sausalito in 2022 and is still a member of the Sausalito City Council. In 2020, she also founded the Center for Sea Rise Solutions, a global nonprofit focused on coastal resilience and ocean health. She also most recently announced her candidacy for California Lieutenant Governor in 2026. Janelle, thanks for being here. Can you begin by sharing a bit more about your work on disaster finance challenges, both as a member of Sausalito City Council and former mayor, and also through your center? What types of solutions are you exploring to address your challenges?
Thanks, Helen. Thank you for the excellent organization. We had such a great prep call. I had wished that we had recorded it. I needed Doug in the room to help us with that. And also thank you, Carolyn. We've been talking about this for a couple of years now, and I feel very fortunate to have gotten plugged in to this community. So I ran for city council after spending 20 years in Sausalito. I'm originally from Pennsylvania, but I came to the West Coast for law school. And I was on and off my planning commission in Sausalito for about 10 years. And when I got asked to help plan something called the general plan, it's a 25-year planning document, and took a hard look at it in 2018, 2017, we didn't have anything around sustainability. There's nothing around climate resilience. Our infrastructure section was really dated. Our housing section was really dated. And I started to ask these questions around, well, what are we doing around sea level rise? What are we doing about landslides? And I got a lot of blank stares. And so I ran because I thought maybe I could help contribute to some solution as an environmental and land use attorney. And I quickly found there was a lot of work to be done. Sausalito, if you don't know it, is the first most beautiful community across the Golden Gate Bridge. Outside of San Francisco. We have two ways into town. One is more of a surface road, runs along the waterfront. The other is the main Highway 101, and then surface roads in between. It's a very steep community, not unusual. The lot across the street from me has a 40% average gradient. We have that perfect storm, literally, of natural disasters, flooding, landslides, heat events, potential wildfires. Those literally could all hit us at one time, and I didn't even mention earthquakes. So it's a precarious opportunity for us to make improvements. Let me show a couple of anecdotes to help kind of give a perspective. In 2019, we had a massive landslide in the south part of town. It was on private, public, and federal property. What happened is we had major storm events in quick succession. The soils got saturated. We couldn't handle it. The slope was unstable. It took out an entire valley, took out, I think, 5 or 6 different homes. A woman was trapped in her home. She managed to survive. Her cat did not. I mean, it was bad. If you just Google Sausalito landslides, it'll come up and you'll see the photographs. We then got sued, and our insurance pool wasn't able to cover all of it. So of course, we as a city, a small city, our general fund is around 25 million, had to find monies. So we went to look for reimbursement to Cal OES and to FEMA. And we had to hire a consultant to get the reimbursement because working directly with the agencies just wasn't giving us any money back. And I think we ended up getting about $500,000. And it didn't even take into account the fact that it was federal Golden Gate National Recreation Area lands above. Below that was Caltrans, which is the state transportation authority. And below that was our land and then private land. So mixed jurisdictions, mixed opportunities, and a very, very long and expensive process for our city. Fast forward now, 2023, we had major storm events. We had probably 500 or 600 100-year storms in quick succession, including hurricane force winds, 73, 78 miles per hour, I can't remember. And Coast Guard started sending us video of storm surges coming over our main thoroughfare and literally up and over cars. That's how high it was. And we had just some riprap down there on the main road. And so that's a very real risk for us. But I also have private property owners call me and say, our hillside came down. It's private land, but we're tired. We're on a fixed income. We can't afford the contractors to spend $250,000 to engineer this and build a retaining wall. Can't the city do something? So, well, the city doesn't have the money to give to you. Well, can't FEMA do something? Well, it's not a disaster zone, so no, FEMA didn't come into play. And of course, in California, it's very difficult to get full coverage for things like water intrusion and landslides. And so their insurance didn't cover it. So, of course, very frustrating. But I have the benefit of knowing a lot of you in the room and folks from Swiss Re and Guy Carpenter, and so I called them up and said, this parametric insurance thing you guys are talking about, talk to me about it. How do we make this happen in our community? And so we are digging in and trying to figure out how can we provide a parametric insurance policy for our community so that when these events come to fruition, which they do and they will and they are, we have a way to pay out just even to quickly get people back on their feet. We're immediately seeing some massive opportunity as well as massive struggles. The most basic of which is we lack the data to figure out what should be the trigger for the parametric insurance policy. We also have convoluted issues. Is it a landslide? Is it a flood? Is it both? And then who would pay for it? What's the governance? Does the city own the policy? Is there an improvement district that owns the policy? From a governance structure, it's actually quite complicated. Somebody earlier today mentioned community resilience districts. So this is new legislation that allows us to plan on a regional multi-jurisdictional basis. I think there's a lot of opportunity around those. I think the only way we can really plan in all our communities, but particularly in the Bay Area, is through regional planning because there's so many hydrologic connections. And we can see how that plays out. And so the CRDs are a really good opportunity for us. Another option, and Kathy is here as well, we've been looking at is geologic hazard abatement districts, your GADs, to figure out can we create some type of improvement district around that, knowing that there's going to be some impact from landslides. One of the things I try to think about as a lawyer and elected representative is how do we count for market effects of legislative decisions? And so I wanted to add this wrinkle for you all that we can sit in this room and talk about climate impact. But the biggest struggle are all the other impacts from all the other policies we have to implement that are often handed down to us a little bit in a vacuum that don't really account for the feasible implementation on the ground. An example I'll give you is we very, very badly need more affordable housing in the state of California. And it's really difficult to find locations that, in largely built out communities like ours, that aren't prone to floods, that aren't prone to some type of landslide activity. How do we balance that really important mandate, that really important requirement with risk? Because I don't want to put affordable housing, I'm not going to do it, I'm not going to in a contaminated area, in a flood zone area. That just doesn't make sense. So how do we manage that and balance that, knowing that we have long-term planning for resilience? I think it was Mike Peterson from the California Commissioner's Office who offered us a framework today that I want to repeat that I think is really helpful. We talked about risk assessment, communication, reduction, and transfer. So in addition to finding new ways to implement things like parametric insurance, I'd love to find ways for communities to get the benefit of reducing their risk, the benefit of conducting vulnerability assessments. I was very pleased as the mayor, I was able to harangue our state assemblyman to give us $1 million for sea level rise vulnerability assessment. That money went through the California Department of Emergency Services. And I would love if there was some intertie with the Department of Insurance so that I could then take this out to you all and say, okay, I've created risk reduction, I have a vulnerability assessment. How do I make that pay for my community long term? Does that reduce my premium? Does it reduce my residents' premium? And so the last thing I'll leave you with is sort of 3 ideas that maybe we can explore. And I don't know if this is unique to California or not, but hopefully it's a broader example. So the first is utilities. So Pacific Gas and Electric, our large utility, has been caught in litigation around wildfires. And they've committed to underground at least 10,000 miles of wires. Somebody earlier today talked about engaging the private sector and having them pay for a lot of the insurance policies or figuring out how to engage them on these policies. Would there be an opportunity for us to engage PG&E to have them become a partner to us on mitigating risk, reducing risk, and helping us maybe pilot some of these new parametric insurance policies? Because they're already being tagged and undertaking efforts to underground. Are there other things they can do when it comes to risk reduction? Already mentioned the opportunity to not just have everything look like emergency services, but also risk reduction and risk transfer. I think if we start seeing our insurance commissioners talking more about climate, and we do, Commissioner Lara in California does a great job of it, it signals to the private sector that this is a climate issue that we're all tackling on all fronts. And then the last thing, as I mentioned, is regional planning. So I often joke that I'll never draft a white paper because I don't want to read one. And when I see something that says, resilience planning for elected officials, and it's like 30 pages, 9-point font, it's not for me. I mean, I can read it, I can, I promise. But we talk about communication. I think it's really important to understand that a lot of officials, a lot of elected officials, we want to do this work. A lot of people don't have the benefit of what happened to have here today with you all, of knowing who to call, of having these conversations. And so I think collectively we need to find ways to better communicate the information and the opportunity. And I'll finish by saying that's why I launched this NGO, the Center for Sea Rise Solutions. The whole idea behind it is to travel around the country and then do some subnational climate diplomacy in Europe to be able to interact with other elected officials so that we can kind of debunk this myth of a lack of political will, because sometimes it's not that. Sometimes it's literally don't know how to get started, or don't know how to fund it, or don't know which engineer to call. And some of those seem like really low-hanging fruit for us because we do this work, but just to remind you all, everybody needs a little bit of help sometimes, and so go easy on us.
Thanks so much, Janelle. And for our final introduction, we have Len. Len Matterman is CEO of the San Mateo County Flood and Sea Level Rise Resiliency District, also known as One Shoreline. It was established in 2020 by the state that year as the first independent government agency in California focused on water-related impacts of climate change. Among his many accomplishments, Len has also recently served as the first public policy practitioner in residence at Stanford University's Center for the American West and was a contributing author on 2 books about financing resilience to climate change. Len, can you please share with us a few examples of how you're working to tackle the challenges you see in your area through One Shoreline and the solutions that you're considering?
Sure. Thank you very much for having this panel and for having me on it. So the region that I work in is between San Francisco and San Jose, and the basic story of our basic climate story is we have drought punctuated by atmospheric rivers, and that's where we're at in terms of our winters now, and that has multiple impacts, not just in terms of flooding, but other impacts. And we're also the most at-risk county for sea level rise in the state of California. Almost any metric you could imagine: people, property, hazardous waste sites, underrepresented communities, et cetera, et cetera. The median household income in our floodplain is countywide is 30% below the median household income for the whole county. And so that's obviously a group of populations that we're particularly interested in. We did have several disasters that hit our area starting New Year's Eve, really, and going through March this past winter. And like so many of others have pointed out today, the disaster aid really hasn't shown up yet in a meaningful way or almost in any way for the communities that most need it so far. Our population, generally speaking, I like to think of as the donor class to the National Flood Insurance Program, and rather than a recipient class, because they haven't historically, since the program was started, they haven't historically received substantial funds, but they're still in the special flood hazard area and have to pay out on an annual basis. So that combined with incredibly low insurance literacy makes it so that it's hard to increase uptake in our area of insurance programs. And I wanted to just spend a second on insurance literacy. We haven't really talked too much about it, but for the general public, it's extremely low. And then one level of that closer to the issue would be elected officials. And my board are 2 county supervisors and 5 city elected officials, mayors or council members, what have you, from some of the 20 different cities in our county. And they have extremely low literacy. And I have extremely low literacy, and I've been talking about these issues for the past decade. I'm not of the industry, and so I think that's really important when we start talking about, how do we get something done at a local level? You have to understand, well, what is their base of knowledge going into the conversation? And generally speaking, it's very low, and that's something that we all have to work on, I think. So as you mentioned, our agency is newly created 3.5 years ago. We're called a special district in California, which means we're created by state legislation for a specific purpose. And that's important. It's different than a county. It's different from a city. And it gives us, I think, sometimes unique disadvantages and unique advantages in this whole conversation. And of course, we like to think about the unique advantages and how that can help us. Generally speaking, our agency is focused on land use planning and zoning. We do a lot of work in that space. We do resilience projects. We're right now doing the largest sea level rise related project in the state of California in our county, tied into San Francisco Airport, which also is a big project related to sea level rise. And we do early warning systems for the county. And seemingly, we're getting into the insurance conversation. There is a bill that was 2 days ago finally passed out of the legislature, and it's sitting on the governor's desk. And Deborah can speak more about it in a little bit today. From the California Department of Insurance, but that bill calls for pilot projects, 8 of them around the state, and one of them, we're very pleased, is One Shoreline as a local agency. So there's a lot of opportunities. The key questions that we're asking as we try to develop a pilot project is, what is the trigger for payment? That was mentioned by Janelle and others today. And it's not just a trigger in terms of what is the data spit out, when should a payment be made, but the politics comes into the trigger and economics and not just talking about risk. And so there's a lot of elements to that question that I think we need to figure out and have folks like the California Department of Insurance help us with that. Another key question is, what is the role of local government? I think of if we develop a pilot project, on one end of the spectrum is we're a cheerleader and we think this is great and we talk it up and we encourage the public to get behind it and other local elected officials, et cetera. On the other end of the spectrum, we're a provider. And is that even possible under what the rules are and the guidelines, et cetera, in the state of California? And where do local governments fit into that? And I think that's really key, is to think about that spectrum and where we would fit in. In terms of solutions, which you asked me to talk about as well, I guess when we're thinking about a pilot project right now, there are really 2 things we're thinking about. In the resilience projects that we build, which are by definition, in our case, multi-jurisdictional, not just within one city, we align the protection for both the well-resourced and the under-resourced communities. And that's super important to us, both for political reasons, but also so that we don't have any technical issues later that one neighborhood gets flooded and another doesn't. So in the resilience that we build in these projects, we align that protection. And we should do the same for getting the dollars to who and when it's most needed after a disaster. We want to align that as well between well-resourced and under-resourced communities. So we're fortunate in San Mateo County. We have headquarters of many large corporations, and there are low-income communities surrounding two very well-resourced organizations. One is Facebook, and one is Oracle, and another is Stanford University. And so what we're trying to do as one aspect of our pilot is to say, okay, there are well-resourced organizations that are surrounded by communities that are low income. How do we spread the burden of the insurance among all of them together in one aggregated effort? And that's something that we've started to talk about with Facebook at their headquarters and Stanford University. All of them are in the special flood hazard area. They all have exposure. They all have insurance needs. And then the other kind of idea for the solution besides that is California already has a program to disperse post-disaster money quickly, and it's through our state's Department of Social Services, and it's a program called the Storm Assistance for Immigrants program. And that distributes the money through Catholic Charities. It's a relatively new program. It distributes about half of what would be needed for the $10,000 deductible that Nick mentioned, which is something we're also thinking about, is how do we get to that deductible level as a starting place for this program? And so if our state is already funding that for undocumented folks, for the immigrant community, and it's through Catholic Charities, which has more credibility than the government agencies do to work with those populations, then is there a way for us to cover the rest of the cost? That's about half the cost. Is there a way for us to cover the rest of the cost and quickly allow that money to go out to those who need it most, but also allow them to increase their NFIP deductible to $10,000, getting money quickly, but also lowering their premiums in the end. So I'll stop there, but those are some of the things we're thinking about.
Thank you so much, Len. And you lead me in really well to our next question, which relates to insurance literacy. We're going to open it up to everyone to ask questions at the end, so please start brainstorming here, but I'm going to pose a few more questions to the panelists first. So turning back to you, Anne, can you share a little bit more about what the role of insurance literacy or the lack thereof plays, not only in enabling new types of solutions for target populations, but also moving forward in local and state government?
Well, I can speak to the fact that this is one of the things that we're seeing actually in some of the early outcomes of this Robert Wood Johnson grant is the fact that there is an understanding generally of what insurance is, but it comes back to the basics. They don't know how they're going to pay for it. And they don't really understand what is in a policy and what isn't. They think they need it, but they don't know the ins and the outs. So I do think we're seeing a need for a heightened awareness and literacy, focusing on financial awareness and insurance. We have also applied to FEMA for HMGP funds to try to do some it's a 5% initiative project proposal to create a literacy type pilot out there to accompany our efforts in this PD watershed area. And along with that, there, would have to probably be some sort of a funding mechanism for coverages for LMI, families that want to participate. Do we know what that's going to look like exactly? No, but I hope that we're able to have those discussions on a larger scale once we get the information in from the survey. I mean, we're finding that these surveys are showing us that there are a myriad of problems, not only from the fact that these folks have tried to get assistance through other organizations, faith-based, et cetera. Some of them have received assistance, some of them have not. It is causing health problems, both emotional and physical. So I see all of this rolling up into something larger, and I think literacy is going to be a fundamental component of it. I hesitate to say awareness and educational program because I don't want to be condescending in any way, but just to help people understand the differences, because insurance is complicated. And it leads to a whole host of other things. The one thing I would like to add is that mitigation, however this turns out, mitigation would be a part of whatever the result would be. I think it has to be, and that pulls Safe Home back in. We need to have more resilient structures. I heard earlier that the majority of the homes in the U.S. are already already built and not new construction, and that couldn't be a truer statement, especially for this area that we're talking about, and probably South Carolina on the whole. Just two other things I wanted to just mention was that we are seeing an issue with heirs property, and there are organizations that try to assist with that, but that is a very complicated process. I know FEMA has tried to help in some of those instances on a recovery end, but heirs property is a continued problem. And again, we're seeing the health concerns and the employment issues all joining into this whole effort of trying to become a more resilient and more sustainable community.
Thanks, Anne. Would anyone else like to chime in here? Nick?
Yeah, so we kind of previewed this on the call, but and I don't know, maybe it's a difference because we have more of an interior flooding risk, but I feel very uncomfortable going into a low-income community and saying you need to buy flood insurance. And that's what FEMA wants me to do. I'm the National Flood Insurance Coordinator for the district, so we get money from FEMA, and part of that money is supposed to be going to flood insurance awareness. But I just don't see how you can do that with a straight face when these people they're saving for their kids' college, or maybe they just had a medical emergency, and I'm telling them that they need to spend $1,000 a year on a flood insurance premium for something that might not happen. I know all of us in the room understand why insurance is a good thing, but just on the very practical level, like, it's just a crazy thing to go into these communities and say. So at least from my perspective, and I don't speak for the district government, but in my flood program, I do not want to ask people to sign up for insurance. I just want to make it happen for them. And again, we're focused on the low-income population that if a flood happens, they really needed insurance. And if they really needed insurance, they can't afford it up front.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. And on the next panel, we'll be formally getting into what are called community-based solutions, and so I'll let those folks talk about it more. But I think what's really true across most of what you guys are exploring is ultimately government or aggregator entities, assuming this role of trying to purchase in some way or through a grant on behalf of the community for exactly the reasons you're describing, that it's so hard to go direct to household at the lowest income level. And so government needing to assume some of that coverage. Moving on to the next question. There's so many different challenges for enabling these new solutions, but regulatory hurdles, as we discussed a little bit on one of the past panels, is one major challenge. Liz, can you share a little bit more as what you see as opportunities for addressing barriers in Louisiana?
Yeah, thanks, Helen. So I want to start by just talking through the complexity of engaging in the regulatory processes, right? So our fortified roof program, long before there was $30 million allocated from the state legislature, went through a rulemaking process at the end of last year. There are periodic public comment periods. In the state of Louisiana, there is a potpourri period where a sort of informal notice of the rule is published. In some cases, certain agencies require you to hand deliver comments or to pay a fax filing fee, and then 3 days later require you to hand deliver the comments. They eventually publish the notice of intent. But the really candidly, just procedurally complicated and wonky processes are not welcoming for people who are most impacted by the design of the rule to participate in those processes. So where at the time when the rule was actually initiated and the rulemaking process was actually initiated from the Department of Insurance, we could have seen multiple partners issuing comments, ensuring that they were elevating the need for the program to be means tested or to have geographic prioritization based on risk. And That still does not account for the reality that our insurance commissioner has to have a value set where they would prioritize that input. And the reality is that in regulatory processes, the people with political influence, the people that do spend lobbying money or electoral action money, are the people that can typically get in behind the scenes to ensure the insurance commissioner is well aware of what the causes and maybe risks or benefits, both political viability wise, but also in terms of their political value set might be if they incorporate things like means testing. So I think we need to be a little bit more candid about the extent to which political factors are influencing our ability to regulate properly and to pass regulations that are actually informed by the increasing risks that we know we're facing. In Louisiana, we know we need to get to comprehensive land use planning according to watershed level. We know we need to be restricting development in areas that are increasing development that are susceptible to flooding. But the political prospects of getting that regulation or getting the statutory authority to pass that type of regulation, which in the case of land use planning would be required, require other types of investments that typically are not made to benefit the average Louisianan. They're made to benefit people who benefit from being able to purchase low-cost, high-risk land, turn it around, sell slab-on-grade homes with granite countertops and stainless steel appliances and call it fine. Right? And so we have to get in a mindset where we're actually acknowledging the political realities and finding ways to tag team, because every organization doesn't have to do all the things, on how to improve political viability, on how to change the political calculus, and how to understand the influence back and forth between the statutory conditions that are advanced by the state legislature, the funding that would be required to be allocated by the state legislature or by the governor's office, and then also the regulations that are required to ensure that there's actually positive benefits to Louisianans based on those regulatory improvements. And so I want to again underscore a statement I made earlier that across Louisiana, the insurance crisis is top of mind for Louisianans. Top of mind. A top 3 issue for most Louisianans is insurance. Are we talking about that in the context of legislative races? Are we talking about that in the context of our governor's race? How is this being operationalized is an open question. How do we leverage the frustration and concern of Louisiana residents to help folks be engaged on how their elected representatives are and are not making decisions that actually benefit them in the long term, both as we try to reduce risk, as we try to think more creatively about how to transfer some risk, and how we try to actually create creative models that can be more accommodating for low-income Louisianans and Louisianans that are especially susceptible to disaster.
Thanks so much, Liz. And sticking with the political focus, I want to turn to you, Janelle. Looking at how do you introduce untested insurance solutions in state and local government? Can you share some of your perspective of what that looks like as an elected?
Yeah, I was just, sorry, grab that back from you. I was just thinking as Liz was commenting about education and communication and how important that is across all levels of the community, including the people making the decisions at the end of the day. A lot of people go into public service for a variety of different reasons. It could be the schools in their community, it could be the parks, it could be really, really anything, and they may not have the level of understanding or knowledge that they wish to have on all issues all the time. And so I think the work that you all are doing in educating the communities and elected officials around the opportunities is huge. Joe and Bridget were in a call with me with my city manager, my head of public works, my sustainability and resilience manager, and we were all coming at the idea of community-based catastrophic insurance with a parametric trigger from a different perspective. And everybody was going down their own rabbit hole based on their knowledge bank. Our public works guy wanted to address all the things at one time, and our sustainability manager wanted to make sure it was climate focused, right, and so on. And so a lot of this stuff is just really brand new to a lot of people. In the state of California, I would be surprised if insurance wasn't a top issue because we do have State Farm and others leaving the state. but it gets couched in different ways. And so the way, I think the more you can educate your elected officials on the opportunity, not just the risk, and the more you can tie it into other topics of concern within that community, whether it's infrastructure or it's affordable housing or it's equity, there are ways to talk about this based on where people come to the table. I'll also say Len is very, very humble, because I look to One Shoreline and his work in the special district as an incredible example of how we might organize ourselves on a regional basis for all things climate resilience, not just sea level rise. And so, Len, I thank you for your work on that, and I think it's a real opportunity for us as we move forward and try to get our electeds involved.
Thanks so much, Janelle. Tally, we heard from Theodora earlier from the Center for New City Neighborhoods and the pilot there. Can you share a little bit more about the role of the city as an advisor in this pilot, and more broadly, the considerations for city governments and institutionalizing new policies and programs like that?
Yeah. So the pilot that Theodora talked about on the last panel, the Flood Recovery Fund, which is using a parametric model, it's been a collaboration between our office at the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice, CNYCN, EDF, SBP, through this NSF-funded pilot, as well as all of the private sector partners who are involved, like Guy Carpenter, Swiss Re, and all of those, as I'm getting eyes from Joe Becker at the back of the room to make sure I mention the private sector partners. But as we were thinking about the design of this program in the early phases, the phase one, before we even got to what are we actually doing to help fill some of these existing gaps, we had a lot of conversations about, should New York City be the entity taking out the policy? Ultimately, we made the decision to not have the city be the one holding the policy, and we moved into an advisory role. And that has a lot to do with the fact that there are a lot of complexities for a city government to take out an insurance policy, and there are a lot of complexities for a city government in some instances to actually provide direct funding or support to private property owners. And so for in New York, for example, our relationship with New York State means that we have limitations on what we can provide to households. We can't provide direct repairs to homeowners using city budgeting. We can't provide direct grants to New York City homeowners unless we have a very clear reasoning behind why we are doing that, often tied to life safety. And so these blue skies programs, like an insurance policy, that becomes really, really challenging. Our advisory role in this project has been to provide context around New York City, around what government can do, to provide information around the flood modeling and other flood risk indicators that we have. It's also a huge opportunity for us to learn. A learning pilot is really, really big if you want to take this to the next level and do something at scale. And so all of the work that we're doing through, that will ultimately be done through evaluation and thinking about replicability are lessons that we as city government can take back to our other colleagues and make a case as to why this is important on a larger level over time and permanently. There are a lot of barriers to institutionalizing new policies and innovation. We really need a proof of concept. I've worked in city government now for a number of years. I can guarantee you that when I go in and put a budget request in, I'm not getting approved the first time. I have to have a lot of data behind me. I have to show that it works, because every time that we get money for one thing, it means that money is being taken away from other programs and other services. And in the day-to-day of an individual household and city services, that's incredibly important. That's trash pickup, that is social services, that's mental health services. And so that budgeting aspect is like point one in terms of institutionalizing. The other big thing is capacity. Even city governments the size of New York, we are incredibly large, we are incredibly bureaucratic, as Helen mentioned, but we don't necessarily have huge capacity to take on new projects. And even when we do find that capacity in terms of actual people, there's a lot of training and education, as we've all talked about financial literacy up here, that has to be done to make sure that everyone within the government understands these complex things like insurance. As everyone has said, most people do not. That takes a lot of ongoing annual training. And governments aren't stagnant. We get new administrations that come in all the time. We get new city councils that come in all the time. And so as those changes are happening, especially for new projects that are just getting off the ground, you're often going back and doing retraining to continue to build that capacity to keep that interest. the last thing I'll say is that government isn't always the answer. And so when thinking about institutionalizing new concepts and policies like a parametric program, local partners are so important because they're already on the ground talking to residents. And they often, through that grassroots movement, through that local organizing, have a lot more power to institutionalize. And government has a much bigger role to support those organizations in doing that work, because we don't have those direct contacts with the people and what they need.
Thanks so much. Janelle?
Can I just add to that? Maybe it's a challenge for all of us. Everything you said, like spot on. I completely agree with all of that. Pilots, like let's do this. Let's roll out like 20 parametric insurance pilots next year. There's an organization. Kathy, I pick you. I didn't pick you, right? Like there's an organization called Climate Mayors. 500 cities are part of Climate Mayors. Let's sit down with the executive director, find 20 cities, and pilot this, because that is what the industry needs to see. That's what peer groups need to see. And once you get that off the ground, other communities want it. I have the benefit of sitting on a bunch of different task forces in my county, and when I come back from a trip, I get to download with my peers, and we learn so much from each other when you exchange that information. I'd love to be able to take this into my county and San Mateo County through Len. And so I think if we could just, maybe a great action item, I love action items coming out of this conference, is let's find 20 communities where we can pilot it. And Tally's absolutely right. It doesn't need to be through a mayor, it doesn't need to be through a municipal government, because we rotate, we have limited shelf life. Community groups are great, right? Who've been there for a long time, who understand the issues. But if anybody is interested in that, I'm sitting back there. I'd love to talk with you.
Thanks, Janelle. And I think that action item is really what we're hoping for ultimately from this conference is thinking about who else needs to enter this conversation. How do we get more communities and places and stakeholders involved, as we've been discussing, again, all the needs to really get more to a piloting stage and hopefully at scale eventually. Last question, and then we'll open up for discussion for everyone. Len, I think you might have started to mention it earlier, but one of the central questions here that you guys have talked about a little bit is who pays for an insurance policy. And so I was wondering if you can unpack a little bit more, some of your insights and the ways you're thinking about, again, who ultimately could pay for some of the ideas you're thinking about.
Well, I mean, what we're thinking about for potential pilots, I'm probably not the right person to answer that question, first of all. But what we're thinking about for the pilots would be how do we bring in the private sector entities that are significant players in our region, that also have to pay insurance, that are co-located with low-income communities, and how do we spread the burden so that the low-income community and like I said, the one, for example, surrounding the Facebook headquarters campus, which is in our county, their cost burden is double the rest of the county. It's triple the rest of the city that they're in. It's nuts. They don't have greater risk. It makes no sense. So how do we spread that burden to include their neighbor across the street, which just happens to be Facebook? And I don't use the word Meta, I use Facebook. And so how do we share that among the well-resourced and non-resourced? So that's kind of a key aspect of how we're thinking about it. But in terms of all the kind of aspects to developing insurance programs, as I said, I'm not the insurance expert, so I'll defer to somebody else.
You've been thinking about this a long time, and we have Raghavir and Kate and some others who I know have been also thinking about ways to engage employers and again, how they can get involved in the insurance space. Does anyone else have any other thoughts, again, on this who pays question, and then we'll open it up.
Yeah, just real quick. I find it interesting that, so in past examples of interior flooding in the district, either our water and sewer authority, because so many resident complaints, or the city has put together a little fund to help reimburse people that got flooded. So the city paid. It was just sort of after the fact. And then even if there isn't that kind of program, the city pays for it in other ways, with property tax assessments going down or whatever it is. So I think some kind of talking point. Yeah, I'm sure our city budget office would be like, Nick, what are you talking about? But I think one of the talking points is, like, you are going to be paying for this in some way anyways. Why not get out in front of it and kind of spread that risk profile?
Oh, thanks, Nick. And I think that's, again, it's the challenge is how do we get folks to pay a premium each year rather than just pay for the response after, when ultimately it might balance out in some ways, but really challenge to make that case during Blue Skies. With that, I'd like to open it up. Are there any questions for the panelists?
Fortunately, I actually have read that. Rockefeller, the program is no longer around, but they split off into Resilient Cities Catalyst and Resilient Cities Network. Both are doing amazing work in cities around the country with focus on under-resourced communities. But thank you for mentioning that, because they really are two great resources. I'll also mention that this idea of risk, when a community thinks about it, insurance is something a lot of people don't understand. And so they don't really want to engage on it because they don't fully, it means they have to pay something. So they don't want to talk about that. But what I do want to talk about is running water. I want to talk about sanitation. I want to talk about my roads. And so oftentimes, even in my community, if somebody doesn't want to talk about changing climate or climate change or insurance, I'm happy to talk about infrastructure, because those are all part of the same conversation. And so I think that use of the word risk is really helpful, because find out where your community is concerned about risk and then address that and use the language that makes sense for that community. So thank you for that comment.
Thanks. Any other questions or comments? I can imagine. Here we go. Please.
Tenacity. I say it jokingly, but I think that's part of it, right? Innovation takes time, and there are all these hurdles, especially with state and federal government. The more you push and continue to submit like the same application over and over and over again, the more people start to notice. Not related to the insurance space, but we do a lot of work on heat resilience. Heat is not really covered in a lot of the FEMA grants, for example. Calculating the social costs and the social benefits of resiliency work is not captured. But we have had some success in kind of continuing to submit applications, continuing to have conversations with state and federal partners to rethink that. But it takes all of those applications and tenacity and persistence and being that annoying person for the state and federal government to have some success. It's not the golden ticket, but it does help.
Anyone else want to comment? Janelle, feel free to.
I wish I had a silver bullet magic piece of legislation that fixed it, but I'm going to give you a really real answer. Never underestimate the power of local champions. Squeaky wheels really get the grease in local politics, and obviously I'm working at a much different scale than you're operating at, and I have appreciation for the complexities of that. But I am in awe of local champions who keep coming to the table and keep pressing us to innovate and to think about things differently. And if you keep going back, it is extremely tiring and hard work, and it's so worth it. So I wish I had something that operated at scale. I don't, other than collective community action and perseverance and what Tally was talking about.
Yeah, Len.
Yeah, I was just going to say, the federal government does understand the resilience of infrastructure and the resilience of people's homes and people's livelihoods. And I think one theme that has come up over and over for me today is the relationship between the resilience of those things and financial resilience. And so developing programs that kind of wrap that together and allow the feds to pay for what they know or understand or think they want to fund, and spinning off of that the financial resilience piece, which I think is directly related, and it should be directly related, and it's on all of us to directly relate it, can allow you to take the federal money for the purposes that they want, but also leverage that to get the benefits for the financial resilience piece.
And just real quick, I know we have some FEMA folks in the room. I think FEMA has to decide whether you want to provide grant funding to get us to do the NFIP, or can you open it up and make it more broad and provide grant funding to just be more resilient financially to these floods? Because we can't use FEMA funding for the stuff that we're looking into that is a better fit for our needs.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I think we have a question or comment. No, thank you. Well, I think it's just very clear we need layered measures here to really solve a lot of what we're talking about. Unfortunately, we are out of time, so please feel free to come up to the panelists or find anyone to discuss further. We're going to take a 15-minute break and come back together at 3 o'clock. Thank you so much, and thank you again to our panelists.